Good day. This discussion video is intended for Psychology 103 and or theories of personality. Each of us has what we call a personality, and the idea of the type of personality that we have could somehow determine the strengths or weaknesses we have as a person. We can conclude that the aspects we have within ourselves could help us determine if we could be successful in that certain situation or not. As individuals, we tend to have our judgments about personalities. We have already an idea of describing whether that person has a positive or negative personality. For example, we can describe someone having a terrible personality based on how he interacts with people. May it be his showing an unfriendly behavior, an aggressive one, or somehow he is difficult to be with. It's not just you who is making a judgment on others people personality, but rather the other person is doing as well. So please take note that the subject of personality is not that simple as what we think. People are too complex, and the personality might change based on different situations with different people. That is why we have psychologists and other professionals that devoted their time and effort to evaluating or assessing our personality. Our focus here is not solely what your personality is like, because I believe that all of you here are psychology major students pursuing goals in specializing psychology in your respective fields in the near future. And it is essential for you to know what might be the factors in shaping one's personality in order for you to understand a person's behavior. For this subject, we will be tackling different theories that have their concepts of personality, which we will be discussing one by one. So let's first define what personality is. Personality originated from the Latin persona, which referred to a theatrical mask worn by Roman actors in Greek dramas. These ancient Roman actors wore a mask, or what we call a persona, to project a role or false appearance. However, this definition is not an acceptable one because psychologists believe that the term personality isn't just a role play, but rather it refers to something more than the idea of it. The reason why personality doesn't have a constant definition is that theorists have not agreed on a specific definition of what personality is. As time progresses, there were already a lot of theories have evolved with different concepts on them. Again, I would like to reiterate that we will be discussing various theories and examine the concept of what they meant by personality. On the other hand, what is a theory? A scientific theory is a set of related assumptions that allows scientists to use logical deductive reasoning to formulate testable hypotheses. Most of the time, people considered a theory as the truth or fact, but it should be corrected that a theory is a tool that is being used to generate research and organize observations. Please be remembered that a theory is neither truth nor fact. So let's discuss further the definition of a theory. First, a theory is a set of assumptions. When we will start our discussion of the different theories, the concepts that will be presented are already things or ideas that are accepted as true or at least plausible by researchers. A theory is a set of related assumptions. It must have an internal consistency of each theory. The ideas comprising of the theory should go along with each other. Then, logical deductive reasoning is used by the researcher to formulate hypotheses. This hypothesis will serve as a flow within the theory for the scientists or researchers to reach a logical conclusion. Deductive reasoning starts with a general statement or hypothesis and examines the possibilities to reach a specific logical conclusion. And lastly, the theory includes qualifier testable. The hypothesis rather must be tested unless it is worthless. No, tested in a sense that there is a research conducted to test the hypothesis. To assess something means to evaluate it. The assessment of personality is a major area of application of psychology to real-world concerns. An example here is a clinical psychologist who's trying to understand their symptoms and behavior. The psychologist will attempt to assess their patients' personalities by differentiating between normal and abnormal behaviors and feelings. In this way, the psychologist can provide the best course of therapy to their clients once their personalities were already assessed. Assessment in personality does not limit to psychologists alone. It can be of great help, of course, to guidance counselors, human resources, education, and research. The best techniques of personality assessment adhere to the principles of reliability and validity. First, let's tackle about reliability. This involves the consistency of response to an assessment device. So for example, a person takes a personality test on 2 different days, then showed different scores. Then this means that the test could not be considered reliable because it showed inconsistent scores. A slight variation of scores is okay, but if the gap between those scores is significantly large, then it is likely that something is wrong with the test or with the method of scoring it. Second, validity. So validity refers to whether an assessment device measures what it is intended to measure. First, you need to consider whether the test is intended for a specific aspect that you want to measure. So for example, does a test of anxiety really evaluate anxiety? So if a test does not measure what it claims to, then it is not valid and its result cannot be used to predict behavior. Second, one should also check the content validity of the test. Content validity means that you need to determine the test items or questions and evaluate each item to see if it relates to what the test is supposed to measure. So as we go along with our discussion with different personality theorists, each of them has devised unique methods for assessing personality, which are ways that are appropriate to their respective theory. Their techniques vary in objectivity, reliability, and validity, and they range from dream interpretation and childhood recollections to paper and pencil, and others will also use computer administered tests. So in psychology, in the present psychology today, the major approaches to personality assessments are the following. So first, self-report or objective inventories, projective techniques, clinical interviews, behavioral assessment procedures, and thought and experience sampling procedures. So the self-report inventory approach involves asking people to report on themselves by answering questions about their behavior and feelings in various situations. These tests include items dealing with symptoms, attitudes, interests, fears, and values. Test takers indicate how closely each statement describes their characteristics or how much they agree with each item. Clinical psychologists develop projective tests of personality for their work with emotionally disturbed persons. So, inspired by Sigmund Freud's emphasis on the importance of the unconscious, projective tests attempt to examine that invisible portion of our personality. So the theory underlying projective techniques is that when we are presented with an ambiguous stimulus such as the Rorschach ink blot technique. So as I suggest to search this one. It's very interesting to have this kind of test, the Rorschach ink blot technique, wherein the test takers will be asked to describe what they see, and these will be interpreted by the psychologist. So because the interpretation of the results of projective test is kind of subjective, especially to the Rorschach blot technique, no, these tests are not highly in reliability or validity. So clinical interviews can obtain valuable information by talking to the person being evaluated and asking relevant questions about past and present life experiences. And others also social and family relationships and the problems that led the person to seek psychological help. So, a wide range of behaviors, feelings, and thoughts can be investigated in the interview, including the general appearance of the person, the demeanor and attitude, facial expressions, posture, and gestures, no degree of self-insight, and level of contact with reality. So, clinical interviews remain a widely used technique for personality assessment up to date, and it's a useful tool when supplemented by more objective procedures. In the behavioral assessment approach, an observer evaluates a person's behavior in a given situation. So, the better the observers know the person being assessed, the more accurate their evaluations are likely to be. While in the thought sampling approach, no, a person's thoughts are recorded systematically to provide a sample over a period of time. So because the thoughts are private experiences and the observer cannot see that, no, the only person who can make this type of observation is the individual itself whose thoughts are being studied. So in this procedure, the observer and the person being observed are the same. So a client can be asked to write or tape record thoughts and moods for later analysis by the psychologist. So this is an important aspect of any personality theory that we will be discussing throughout this course. Each theorist has a conception of human nature that addresses the basic issues of what it means to be human. So the following are guide questions that could help us evaluate each theory and define of the theorist's image of human nature. So first is free will or determinism. So this is a controversy whether we humans are we masters of our fate or are we victims of experience, biological factors, unconscious forces, or external stimuli. So forces over which we have no conscious control. Next, this is a very popular debate, the nature or nurture. So which is more important? Influence on behavior, inherited traits and attributes such as our nature or genetic endowment, or the features of our environment, the nurturing influences of our upbringing, no, the education and training. Third, past or present. This involves the relative importance of past events, such as our early childhood experiences compared with events that occur in our recent times. Which is more powerful shaper of personality, our past or the present self? Fourth is uniqueness or universality. So we may think of personality as so individual that each person's action has no counterpart or is the same in any other person. Other theorists interpret that there are overall patterns of behavior accepted as universal, especially to a specific culture, making the behavior of the people the same to its community. Fifth, equilibrium or growth. This involves what we might call our ultimate and necessary life goals. So theorists differ on what constitutes our major motivation in life. So do we function like machines, like some sort of self-regulating mechanism content as long as some internal equilibrium or balance is maintained? And then sixth, optimism or pessimism. So are human beings good or evil, kind or cruel, compassionate or merciless? And lastly, cultural influences on human nature. So cultural differences affect personality development and assessment. It should come as no surprise then to learn that cultural factors influence our image of human nature and the questions we may ask about it. No, so the significance of this discussion is to point out to you that there are many sources of influences on the growth and development of the human personality and diverse ways of explaining its nature. So perhaps one or more of the explanations we describe throughout this course will clash with your views and your image on human nature. So I encourage everyone that as psychology major students, let's learn and appreciate each theory without prejudice. And after all, we're not being forced to believe, but rather I want you all to grasp and understand the concepts of the different theories. Now let's move on to our first theory, the earliest approach to the formal study of personality, which is the psychoanalysis created by Sigmund Freud. Psychoanalysis, in coordination with Sigmund Freud, began his work in the closing years of the 19th century. So the approach of psychoanalysis was the first formal theory of personality and is still the best known up to this date. So Freud's influence has been so profound that more than a century after his theory was proposed, it remains the framework for the study of personality, despite its controversial nature. So some of the other personality theories were inspired by Freud's work. Others, no, other theorists also opposed to it. So Freud's views had an impact not only on psychology but also on the general culture. He succeeded in redefining the human personality and revolutionizing our ways of thinking about human nature. Now, I have already given you the concept notes about Freud's life, which tackles important happenings all throughout his personal and career life. So the different happenings that Freud was able to experience made him also incorporate his projected theory of personality. So I hope you already read the notes as we go along with our discussion. Now, what are instincts? So in Freud's system, instincts are the basic elements of the personality, the motivating forces that drive behavior and determine its direction. So these are mental representations of internal stimuli For example here are hunger or thirst, no, that drive a person to take certain actions. So when a person is in state of hunger, for example, the body is aroused, and this can create a condition of physiological excitation or energy. So the mind transforms rather this bodily energy into a wish. It is this wish the mental representation of the physiological need, that is the instinct or driving force that motivates the person to behave in a way that satisfies the need. Like example, a hungry person will act to satisfy his need by looking for food. The instinct is not the bodily state, rather, it is the bodily need transformed into a mental state, which is a wish. No? So, when the body is in a state of need, the person experiences a feeling of tension or pressure. The aim of an instinct is to satisfy the need, and in order to reduce the tension that is being felt by the individual. So in Freud's theory, this can be called a homeostatic approach. So homeostatic meaning our bodies always seek for physiological equilibrium, like a balance. That's why the theory suggests that we always have this motivation to satisfy our needs once we feel tension in our bodies, because we always seek for balance. Freud indicated that instincts are always influencing our behavior. So what does he mean about it? Freud believed that we always experience a certain amount of instinctual tension, and that I mentioned it a while ago, that in order to reduce the tensions, we seek ways to satisfy it. So it's not all the time that we can immediately seek and satisfy our needs, because we need also to take into consideration our external environment. So there are obstacles and like annoying stimulus that could hinder us into achieving this balance or homeostatic approach in our bodies. Freud also mentioned that people have different ways in how they can satisfy their needs. Like for example, sex drive. So some people can be satisfied by heterosexual behavior, homosexual behavior, or autosexual behavior. Or the sex drive may be channeled into some other form of activity or object. So this explains the diversity we see in human behavior. All the interests, like our preferences and attitudes we display as adults, were believed by Freud to be displacements of energy from the original objects that satisfy the instinctual needs. Okay, so Freud grouped the instincts into two categories: life instincts and death instincts. Okay, so let's focus first on life instincts. So life instincts are the drive for ensuring the survival of the individual by satisfying the needs for food, water, air, and sex, which are oriented toward growth and development. So according to Freud, libido is a form of psychic energy. So it's manifested by the life instincts that drives a person towards pleasurable behaviors and thoughts. While on the other hand, cathexis is an investment of psychic energy in an object or person. So to fully understand it, let me give you an example. Like if you like your roommate, for example, Freud would say that your libido is connected to him or her, to that person that you like. So the life instinct Freud considered most important for the personality is sex. So Freud regarded sex as our primary motivation. So erotic wishes arise from the body's erogenous zones like the mouth, anus, and sex organs. So he suggested that people are predominantly pleasure-seeking beings, and much of his personality theory revolves around the necessity of inhibiting or suppressing our sexual longings. So in opposition to the life instincts, uh, death instincts are the unconscious drive toward decay, destruction, and aggression. So according to Freud, he had this idea of death instincts from biology, that all living things die and decay. That's why he proposed to his theory that people have an unconscious wish to die. So one component of the death instincts is the aggressive drive, which is described as the unconscious wish to die can be turned against objects or other than the self. So the aggressive drive urges us to destroy or conquer or kill. No, it doesn't necessarily mean to yourself, but it is possible that you will be turning it against to a certain person or object. So Freud came to consider aggression as an acting force that is part of human nature. Okay, so Freud divided the personality into three levels: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. So the conscious, as Freud defined the term, corresponds to its ordinary everyday meaning. So it includes all the sensations and experiences of which we are aware at any given moment. So for example, if you're studying for an exam, like as you read your notes, the conscious feeling of holding your pen, no, the sight of the words written on your notes, and the idea you are trying to grasp is part of the conscious level of personality. Freud considered the conscious a limited aspect of personality because only a small portion of our thoughts, sensations, and memories exist in conscious awareness at any time. So, as you can see on your screen, he compared the mind to an iceberg. No? The conscious is the portion above the surface of the water. So, merely, it's on the tip of the iceberg. And then the next level is the preconscious. It is the storehouse of memories, perceptions, and thoughts of which we are not consciously aware at the moment, but that we can easily summon it into our own consciousness. Like for example, if you're currently reading a book, then suddenly you begin to think your friends, no, of what you did yesterday. Preconscious is somewhat bringing up a memory from your like a memory from your preconscious into your current state, your consciousness. So we often find our attention shifting back and forth from experiences of the moment to events and memories in the preconscious level. And lastly, the unconscious. So this is the largest and invisible portion below the surface. So the unconscious part is wherein the focus of psychoanalytic theory. So it's vast, dark, no? Depths are the home of our instincts, our wishes and desires that direct our behavior. So the unconscious contains the major driving power behind all behaviors and is the place of forces we cannot see or we cannot even control it. So that's the unconscious level. So Sigmund Freud also introduced these three basic structures of personality: the id, ego, and superego. So the id operates on the pleasure principle. So every wishful impulse should be satisfied immediately regardless of the consequences. So when the id achieves rather its demands, you experience pleasure. So when it is denied, you experience unpleasure or attention. So the only way the id can attempt to satisfy its needs are through reflex action, wish fulfilling, hallucinatory, or fantasy experience. No, so this is being labeled as primary process thought. So for example lang, for the id portion, when a person is hungry and cannot find immediately any source of food to satisfy his tension, then what the person can do is to have a fantasy experience, like imagining eating a portion of food, to be exact. So to satisfy its needs, that's what we call the primary process thought. In ego, the ego operates according to the reality principle. So it works out realistic ways of satisfying the id's demands. So the ego often postpones the satisfaction to avoid negative consequences of society. So the ego considers social realities and norms, etiquette, and rules in deciding how to behave as an individual. So if the ego fails to use the reality principle, anxiety is experienced. So let's take an example of a child who is being taught to deal intelligently and rationally with the outside world, with the influence of adults. So the child is being taught that they cannot take food from other people unless they are willing to face the consequences. So another example, the child also must postpone the pleasure obtained from relieving anal tensions until they get to a bathroom. So these abilities are called secondary process thought. And lastly, the superego. So the superego incorporates the values and morals of society. So the superego's function is to control the id's impulses. It persuades the ego to choose moralistic goals and to strive for perfection rather than simply realistic ones. The superego is a powerful and largely unconscious set of dictates or beliefs that we acquire in childhood. So these are our ideas or of what is right and what is wrong. Now, so through praise, punishment, and example, children learn which behaviors their parents considered good or bad. No, so those behaviors for which children have been punished form the conscience, one part of the superego. Okay, so the second part of the superego is the ego ideal, which consists of good or correct behaviors for which children have been praised. Okay, so to fully understand the structure of personality, here are some additional examples of how the id, ego, and superego works. Now again, id is the pleasure principle, meeting the basic needs without considering the consequences as long as the needs are achieved. So an example here is Sally, who is thirsty. So a person is thirsty. So for Sally to fulfill her physiological tension of being thirsty, she just casually drank someone else's glass of water. So that's not that's there's no the ego is not part of wherein the ego needs to postpone the tension of Sally feeling thirsty. No, so the difference here again between the id and ego is that the ego deals with the reality. So reality meaning you are aware of the norms, what are the acceptable behavior in our society. Okay, so in ego, the example here being presented is the ego postpones Sally's satisfaction to get the glass of water from someone. So instead of drinking someone else's glass of water, Sally patiently waited for the waiter to refill her glass of water because she knew that eventually the waiter would be back anytime soon. So that's how the ego works according to Freud. So on the other hand, the superego incorporates the values and morals of society. So the superego tries to perfect and civilize our behavior. So it works to suppress all unacceptable urges of the id and struggles to make the ego act upon idealistic standards rather than upon realistic principles. Okay, so according to Freud, the key to a healthy personality is a balance between the id, the ego, and the superego. So if the ego is able to adequately moderate between the demands of reality, the id and the superego is healthy and a well-adjusted personality emerges. Freud also believed that an imbalance between these elements would lead to a maladaptive personality. So, for example, an individual with an overly dominant id might become impulsive, uncontrollable, or even criminal. Such an individual acts upon their most basic urges with no concern for whether their behavior is appropriate or acceptable in society, or even or uh, are their actions are even legal, no, so they don't mind about it. On the other hand, an overly dominant superego might lead to a personality that is extremely moralistic and judgmental. So a person ruled by the superego might not be able to accept anything or anyone that they perceive to be bad or immoral. Okay, so we already have a general idea of what the word anxiety means and how we feel when we are anxious. We know that anxiety is not unlike fear, no, although we may not know what we are frightened of, but Freud described anxiety as an objectless fear. We cannot point it to its source, to a specific object that induced it. So Freud made anxiety an important part of his personality theory, asserting that it is fundamental to the development of neurotic and psychotic behavior. Freud proposed three types of anxiety: reality anxiety, neurotic anxiety, and moral anxiety. So the first type of anxiety is the one from which the others are derived, is reality anxiety or objective anxiety. So reality anxiety involves a fear of tangible dangers in the real world. So uh, most of us have fears of fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, no, and like any disaster. So we run from, like, others also fear for animals, no, wild animals to be exact, speeding cars, and then burning buildings. So reality anxiety serves the positive purpose of guiding our behavior to protect ourselves from actual dangers. Like, for example, a person doesn't want to leave his or her home, no, or house, since he fears being hit by a car, no. Other also have a fear of not uh, lighting a match because of the fear of fire. So the fear here subsides when they consider a threat is no longer present. So the other kinds of anxiety, neurotic anxiety and moral anxiety, are more consistently troublesome to our mental health. So neurotic anxiety has its basis in childhood, in a conflict between instinctual gratification and reality. So children are often punished for overtly expressing sexual or aggressive impulses. So therefore, the wish to gratify certain id impulses generates anxiety. So on the other hand, moral anxiety results from a conflict between the id and the superego. It is a fear of one's conscience. For an instance, now, if you want to express an instinctual impulse that is in contrast to your moral code, your superego gives you this feeling of shame or guilt. No, in everyday terms, you might describe yourself as conscience stricken. Yeah, you can tell a person their level of moral anxiety depending on how developed their superego is. So a person with a strong inhibiting conscience will experience greater conflict than a person with a less stringent set of moral guidelines. So anxiety is a signal that impending danger, a threat to the ego, must be counteracted or avoided. So the following are some Freudian defense mechanisms, which are strategies the ego uses to defend itself against the anxiety provoked by conflicts of everyday life. So defense mechanisms involve denials or distortions of reality. So I've already gave you the additional references regarding Freud's defense mechanisms, and I hope that you're done reading the material. Okay, so let's move on to Freud's psychosexual stages of development. Okay, so according to Freud, a person's unique character type develops in childhood largely from parent-child interactions. So the child tries to maximize pleasure by satisfying the id demands, while parents, on the other hand, as representatives of society, the parents try to impose the demands of reality and morality. They're the ones who will teach, no, first teachers of the child. So, important did Freud consider childhood experiences that he said the adult personality was firmly shaped and crystallized by the fifth year of life. Okay, so Freud sensed strong sexual conflicts in the infant and young child, conflicts that seem to revolve around specific regions of the body. He noted that each body region assumed a greater importance as the center of conflict at a different age. So from these observations, he derived the theory of psychosexual stages of development. So at each stage, as you can see there, is defined by an erogenous zone of the body, which can be seen on the presented table. So in each developmental stage, a conflict exists that must be resolved before the infant or child can progress to the next stage. There are times that a person is reluctant or unable to move from one stage to the next because the conflict has not been resolved, or the needs has been so supremely satisfied by an indulgent parent that the child doesn't want to move on. So in either case, the individual is said to be fixated at this stage of development. So in fixation, a portion of libido or psychic energy remains invested in that developmental stage, leaving less energy for the following stages. So let's start with the oral stage. So the oral stage is the first stage rather of psychosexual development. So it lasts from birth until sometime during the second year of life. So during this period, the infant's principal source of pleasure is the mouth. No? So the infant derives pleasure from sucking, biting, and swallowing. So of course, the mouth is used for survival, for the ingestion of food and water. But it's more than that, according to Freud. Freud placed a greater emphasis on the erotic satisfactions derived from oral activities. Okay, so there are two ways of behaving during this stage: oral incorporative behavior, taking in, and oral aggressive or oral sadistic behavior, biting or spitting out. Okay, so the oral incorporative mode occurs first and involves the pleasurable stimulation of the mouth by other people and by food. So For those adults fixated at the oral and corporative stage are excessively concerned with oral activities such as eating, drinking, smoking, and kissing. So if infants, they were excessively gratified, their adult oral personality will be predisposed to unusual optimism and dependency. So because they were overindulged in infancy, they continue to depend on others to gratify their needs. So as a consequence, they are overly gullible, no, swallow or believe anything they are told, and trust other people inordinately. So such people, they are labeled as oral passive personality types. The second oral behavior, oral aggressive or oral sadistic. So occurs during the painful and frustrating eruption of teeth when they're still a child, no, babies. So as a result of this experience, infants come to view the mother with hatred as well as love. So after all, uh, the mother has been responsible for everything in the infant's environment. So she must also be responsible for the infant's pain. So person who become fixated at this level are prone to excessive pessimism, hostility, and aggressiveness. So they are likely to be argumentative and sarcastic, making so-called biting remarks and displaying cruelty towards others. No, they tend to be envious of other people and try to exploit and manipulate them in an effort to dominate other people. Okay, so around the age of 18 months, no, a new demand, which is the toilet training, is made of the child. So Freud believed that the experience of toilet training during the anal stage had a significant effect on personality development. So defecation produces erotic pleasure for the child, but with the onset of toilet training, the child must learn to postpone or delay this pleasure, no? Or what we know as toilet training. For the first time, gratification on an instinctual impulse is interfered with as parents, no, attempt to regulate the time and place for defecation. So parents will train the child, no, nga when or not to casually poop anywhere, no, or the parents will teach the child, no, that there's a proper place for that, you know, to do the defecation. So if the toilet training is not going well, like for example, if the child has difficulty learning the toilet training, or like the parents are excessively demanding, or how they train the child may react in one of two ways. Okay, so if the child finds the technique difficult, which is being taught by his parents during the toilet training, he or she may develop an anal aggressive personality. So, regressive personality, hostile and sadistic behavior in adult life. So, including cruelty, destructiveness, and temper tantrums. No? So, such a person is likely to be disorderly and to view other people as objects to be possessed. So there are also some instances wherein the child can be able to hold back or retain the feces or poop for several days. So as a result, this can cause the parents to worry and put the attention and affection, no, towards the child. So once the attention, no, that is being felt by the child from his parents would see this, or would interpret it as somewhat a security. In this way, the child was able to discover a technique on how he can have that feeling of affection and attention from his parents by practicing in retaining his feces. No, this behavior is the basis for the development of an anal retentive personality. So the person is likely to be rigid, compulsively neat, no, and overly conspicuous. Okay, so let's move on. Children at the phallic stage display considerable interest in exploring and manipulating the genitals, no, their own and those of their playmates. So pleasure is derived from the genital region, not only through behaviors such as masturbation but also through fantasies. So the child becomes curious about birth and about why boys have penises and girls do not. No, at uh this this age, no, they are curious about it. No, the child may talk about wanting to marry the parent of the opposite sex. So the phallic stage is the last of the pregenital or childhood stages, and phallic conflicts are the most complex ones to resolve. So they are difficult for many people, no. There are a lot of issues, no, or comments about this phallic stage by Freud, because it involves a notion of incest, no, and incest is a taboo in most cultures. So between incestuous desires and masturbation, we can see the seeds of shock, anger, and suppression being sown in the parents of the typical 4-year-old. Okay, so Oedipus complex happens during the phallic stage, so around ages 4 to 5. So the unconscious desire of a boy for his mother, accompanied by a desire to replace or destroy his father. So that's the Oedipus complex. So accompanying the boy's desire to replace his father is the fear that the father will retaliate and harm him. So he interprets his fear of his father in genital terms, like becoming fearful that his father will cut off the offending organ, which is the boy's penis, which is the source of the boy's pleasure and sexual longings. And so, castration anxiety, as Freud called it. So, on the other hand, for the girls, Electra complex is the unconscious desire of a girl for her father, so accompanied by a desire to replace or destroy her mother. Like the boys, the girl's first object of love is the mother, of course, because like the mother is a primary source of food, affection, and security in infancy. But during the phallic stage, the father becomes the girl's new love object. So why does this shift from mother to father take place? No, Freud said here that it was because of the girl's reaction to her discovery that boys have a penis and girls do not. So the girls blames her mother for her supposedly inferior condition and consequently comes to love her mother less. So she may even hate the mother for what she imagines the mother did to her. So she comes to envy her father and transfer her love to him because he possesses the highly valued sex organs. So thus, a girl develops like a penis envy counterpart to a boy's castration anxiety. Okay, so that's for the phallic stage. Now the storms and stresses no of the oral, anal, and phallic stages of psychosexual development are the compositions out of which most of the adult personality is shaped. So the three major structures of the personality is the id, ego, and superego, no, have been formed by approximately the age of 5, and the relationships among them are being solidified. Fortunately, because the child and parents certainly could use some rest, the next 5 to 6 years are quiet. So during the latency period, no, there's no psychosexual stage of development during this time. So the sex instinct is dormant, temporarily sublimated in school activities. That's why there's not much happening, no, during this stage, because the child is more focused on school activities, hobbies, sports, no, and then developing friendships with members of their age. Okay, so the genital stage, on the other hand, is the final psychosexual stage of development. So it begins during the puberty. So the body is becoming physiologically mature, and if no other or no major fixations have occurred at an early stage of development, then the individual may be able to lead a normal life. So Freud believed that the conflict during this period is less intense than in the other stages. Okay, so Freud considered the unconscious to be the major motivating force in life. Our childhood conflicts are repressed out of conscious awareness. So the goal of Freud's system of psychoanalysis was to bring these repressed memories, fears, and thoughts back to the level of consciousness. So Freud developed two methods of assessment, so free association and dream analysis. So free association is a technique in which the patient says whatever comes to mind. So in other words, it is kind of like a daydreaming out loud. Now, while dream analysis is a technique involving the interpretation of dreams to uncover unconscious conflicts. So dreams have a manifest content, the actual events in the dream, and a latent content, the symbolic meaning of the dream events. So here are some dream symbols, no, you can see on your screen there, no, the dream symbols or events and their Latin psychoanalytic meaning. These are all based from Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams. So personality theorists criticize Freud for placing too much emphasis on biological forces, sex, aggression, emotional disturbances, and childhood events. They also criticize his deterministic image of human nature, his negative views of women, and the ambiguous definitions of some of his concepts. However, there is no denying Freud's phenomenal impact on Western culture and on later personality theorists who either elaborated upon or opposed his system. Okay, so psychoanalysis has served no other purpose than to inspire others and provide a framework within which to develop new insights. Then Freud's importance to the world of ideas is secure. So every structure depends on the soundness and integrity of its foundation. Sigmund Freud gave personality theorists a solid, challenging base on which to build. Okay, so that ends my presentation. If you have questions or clarifications, you may contact me on my Facebook account. Okay, so thank you for your attention.